So continuing this thinking that in the making of knowledge and realities, there are no purely free or innocent spaces because everything is in relation, bumping up against, stretching, composing with, and there's always an unevenness and inequity in our discussions. I encourage you to pay attention to these desires that are kind of surfacing in the forums to smooth over this unevenness or these tensions. These desires for purity that are very common in early childhood education, and think about what might be veiled in doing so. If coming to know the world through emergent curriculum is reliant on encounters, as we've been discussing in the last 2 weeks, and the relations that are created in these events, then emergent curriculum has particular ethical commitments to others in ways that are very different than a policy handbook or a code of ethics. Not that policy handbooks and code of ethics aren't important, but I think that emergent curriculum calls on us as educators to be even more deeply committed and involved in our thinking processes and how our pedagogies are responsive to these accountabilities with others and their incommensurabilities. So I invite you this week to think with the BCE-BC Code of Ethics with this lens in mind. And so these 2 quotes are from the Material Encounters book by Veronica Bassini-Cacciabal, Lori Kocher, and Sylvia Kind. And I think that they help us to think more about encounters as sites of possibility, as sites of tension, and as sites for thinking otherwise. They say, we think about an encounter as a moment of meeting, where things and forces and human and non-human beings come together in spaces of difference. Instead of planning or expecting, an encounter looks for the not yet known. It is marked by a sense of not knowing, of hopeful waiting. So this week in our readings, we encounter Leanne Betasimoke Simpson and her orientation to theory from a Anishinaabe perspective. And she writes that Anishinaabe intelligence has been violently under attack since the beginning days of colonialism through processes that remove Indigenous peoples from our homelands, whether those processes are residential or other forms of state-run schools. Outright dispossession, the destruction of land through resource extraction and environmental contamination, imposed poverty, or heteropatriarchal and colonial gendered violence. And so she writes about the ways in which education maintains a knowledge regime that creates conditions of continual exclusion. She writes that, quote, theory within her Anishinaabe context is generated from the ground up. Its powers stem from its living resonance within individuals and collectives. So theory is alive in stories, such as the one that she tells at the beginning of the article about Quenzies, which have been told and retold for generations. And something happens when these stories get lost and when they aren't nourished. But what I want you to pay attention to this week in your discussions, and particularly with the article by Simpson, is that in interpreting her work and thinking about it through a reconceptualist lens, I'm not gesturing that we ought to take her work as our own. Considering difference and positionality, Simpson's response is situated within her place and her stories there. For example, as a settler on Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam lands in North Vancouver, my pedagogies have very different accountabilities and actions in undoing colonial framings. There is no how-to guide or steps to follow to ensure that my work is ethical, but rather I'm required to actively think about where my pedagogies come from, what theories I'm thinking with that enable me to do this unsettling work, and how my orientation enables multiple ways of being and living well together with others in the midst of incommensurable difference. So Simpson's article is not an invitation for us to all take up Indigenous knowledges, nor is it an invitation to appropriate Indigenous knowledges and cosmologies into Western framings. But more so, I think it's an invitation that is differential upon your positionality to consider how are you implicated within colonial discourses and processes, and what is your role as an educator in creating other possibilities. So Simpson's teachings are specific to Anishinaabeg peoples from a very specific region of Ontario, and they're not transferable, they're not generalizable, and they're not transcendental. What I want you to pay attention to in reading this work and in discussing it is not what needs to be done or what you need to implement, but rather I want you to try and stay in those sticky places where she speaks to the structures that assimilate, and consider what kinds of thinking need to be unlearned, undone, and unsettled if multiplicity is to become possible in early childhood education. Not necessarily that anything goes, but what is it that you as an educator are committed to? So this week you're visiting with the Early Childhood Educators of BC Code of Ethics, and pay particular attention to the key principles that are at the top of the document. And considering this week's readings by Leanne Simpson, making ethical decisions here is more than only compliance to a pre-existing framework. So in your reading of the ECEBC Code of Ethics, I invite you to read with a feminist post-structural lens and think together about how the principles of this document could be thought of within this particular orientation. So what does your reading of Simpson's article do to your imaginary of ethics? What does it call on you to consider as you read the ECEBC Code of Ethics? So notice some of the contradictions, correspondences, and parallels, and what they provoke you to think as you begin to think about your ethos as an educator. So also you can think about, how does Simpson disrupt popular discourses to indigenize current education systems? And this is kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, in that we're not seeking to appropriate or necessarily include or add on Indigenous knowledges into a pre-existing Western system. In a reconceptualist orientation, we're seeking to undo the very systems that exclude in the first place. So how does this challenge curriculum as a model or application? How does this reading unsettle the ethics of developmental frameworks in education? How does Simpson discuss consensual engagement? And what might consent do to pedagogy and notions of ethics? So these are some questions to have in the back of your mind as you're working through your exercises this week. So this is returning to something that we spoke a few weeks ago about in terms of crafting an ethos. An ethos is a sort of a broad way of doing and approaching pedagogies. And from a reconceptualist perspective, such as that from the Early Childhood Pedagogies Collaboratory, it's following an interest in diversifying practices, in diversive modes of engagement, entanglement, and co-becoming. Is to avoid stagnation or staticness, to open up the distinct and multiple ways of thinking and doing early childhood education, and to welcome unintended happenings. These ethos are crafted to point that some worlds are more livable than others, and that we make choices about which ones we might craft in the process of enacting our early childhood pedagogies. So this week, in your weekly response, I'm hoping to help you orient yourself into an ethos, which is the character, spirit of your endeavor, the orientation, your dispositions, and qualities of your pedagogical work. An ethos is sort of the underlying qualities that hold our work together, where we're going to be thinking this week, we're going to be thinking more about what we're orienting towards as we compose our manifestos that are due at the end of week 12. So again, thinking about your pedagogical manifesto, some propositions to think with are what are your pedagogies committed to? So thinking about ethics and accountabilities. Who is the child within your manifesto? Who is the educator? How do you imagine the subject? Your understandings of how knowledge is made. And maybe sometimes a metaphor might also be helpful in conceptualizing this work. So this week your task is to create a visual piece that points to these and makes visible the orientations that you plan to take up in your manifesto. So this week is helping you to orient yourself into the full writing of your manifesto for next week's weekly response. So your provocation this week, again, is to orient ourselves toward an ethos that will guide us as early childhood educators. Considering the points below, create a visual piece. This is an original drawing, painting, photograph, or collage. It could be something else as well, that renders visible your emerging reconceptualist orientation as an educator. So this is an opportunity to make meaning of the theoretical perspectives of the course in artful ways. So consider one or more of the provocations below as you make this visual piece. So some of the provocations are, what are your pedagogies committed to? What are your ethical accountabilities? What is your image of the child? What is your image of the educator? How do you think knowledge is made based off readings from this course? And possibly a metaphor that might help you think more about your pedagogical orientation. So in this week's provocation, you're going to be creating something. It could be, again, a drawing, it could be a photograph, it could be a collage, it could be something else, it could be a sculpture. This is totally open, but it needs to be something that is made by you, and in the processes of making it, you're thinking about your orientations that you want to hold on to as you work as an early childhood educator. So you're thinking about the theories and the readings that we've engaged with throughout the course in your processes of making something. So along with this piece, this visual piece, please include a few sentences to accompany it that speak to how the processes of making this piece generated your thinking, and just really describing your thinking processes so that your intentions are visible along with the visual piece that you'll post on eLearn. Also, a quick note, if anybody wants to pop in to my virtual office, you are more than welcome to. You don't even need to necessarily have an appointment. It does help to have an appointment, so if you want me to read your work beforehand, I'll be prepared to discuss it with you. But if you want to just show up, please do just drop in, and I can have a look at your work. We can talk about where you're headed, or if you need any support from me, please do join me. If you can't make it on Thursdays, please do reach out through an email or a message on eLearn, and we can set up a time to meet together and talk. If you want me to look at something that you've been working on or just have any general questions about assignments or the course, that's totally fine. Also posted on eLearn this week is a link to the Climate Action Childhood Network, and I want to draw your attention to their manifestos. These are some examples that might help you thinking about a framing of your manifesto for next week. So please do feel free to take a look at any of these. These manifestos are very provocative, and they're also coming from a similar theoretical orientation that we're taking up in this course. So please do have a look, orient yourselves, and get some inspiration, some ideas. And yeah, again, please do pop into my virtual office, and I hope to see you and talk with you soon. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great week. Looking forward to seeing you in the forums.